I first got introduced to the forecasting tournament by a longtime mentor of mine at Dartmouth, Ben Valentino, who is a political scientist. And he alerted me to an opportunity to forecast with the Good Judgment Project. And this was right around the time when I was leaving Baghdad, Iraq, after my second tour there. And I was looking for some way of doing forecasting because it's been something that I've been interested in for a while, and that's why Ben introduced me to this idea. And the timing worked out as well. I was able to come back to the United States, and that was right around the time the first year of the tournament kicked off, and I just went from there.
Well, in my work on security, a big part of the question is whose security might be in danger in the coming years. So this field of security studies inherently is about forecasting, making predictions about how actors might be vulnerable, what strategies might help them, and so forth. So I got interested in the Good Judgment Project because I wanted to build these skills.
I've always had the interest, and when I first started at my undergrad, I started a bunch of things. I was one of these constantly changing your majors people. And I changed between applied physics is where I started, and then I went to international studies, but then somehow transitioned to anthropology and archaeology. But I always kept the interest up in international studies. So I kind of went from wanting to study current cultures and what was going on to studying past cultures and what was going on there. And that the constant urge to learn more about all societies kept me interested in forecasting, in what was going on in different countries. And as I said, I was switching all the time. I went to quite a few different universities in quite a few different countries. I was at school in, let's start at the beginning, Utah, followed by Vermont, and then Norway, then back to Utah, and I finished my doctorate in Scotland, where I was there for 7 years, and then I went to Ireland for 10 years. So, constantly moving in different cultures, different societies, different political systems, it was always something of great interest to me.
My professional life has involved forecasting because that's what I do or have done to help other people make better decisions, hopefully. But several years ago, I attended a Penn Engaging Minds event in New York City. And Phil Tetlock and Bob Mellers were speaking about the Good Judgment Project, which was very intriguing to me. And so I inquired about joining as a forecaster, and several months later, when positions opened up, I became a forecaster.
I think I am one of those people who can look at things a lot of different ways, and I'm not the most adept at it among the forecasters, but that's definitely my type. And so I was a good fit. But I was also driven because I'm acutely aware of the trouble the world is in, and I think as much as they have a dark side, U.S. organizations like IARPA and the intelligence community in general need all the help they can get. We are basically the good guys, and so there's plenty of driving force behind my interest.
That goes back to when I was a younger man. During the first Gulf War in 1991, I'm interested in the military history, and a lot of people and pundits were making predictions about the outcome, the manner in which the war would be waged and decided, as well as casualty counts and how long it would take. And basically everyone was wrong on the duration and the destructiveness, well, the number of casualties suffered by coalition forces. And that was interesting to me because there was one historian, I'd like to say, Trevor Dupuy, who got it right. And I was interested in how he got it right, and evidently he had a system. And just a few years later, during the 1994 midterm elections, when Bill Clinton lost in a landslide to the Republicans took the Congress for the first time in 40 years. After that defeat, basically every pundit on earth was saying that Bill Clinton was a one-term president. And being a staunch Democrat and a Clinton supporter, I was traumatized by that possibility and wondered whether they knew what they were talking about. And at about that time, I found a book written by another historian, Alan J. Lichtman, about predicting, who would become the next president. And evidently, he had a system where you didn't need to use polls; you just look at history. And using his method, I realized that actually Bill Clinton was in a pretty good shape. His chances weren't guaranteed, but even a year before the election, I had a pretty good inkling that he had a good chance of winning re-election, and this was against what all the pundits were saying. So based on those two events, there were probably other events as well. That's why I became interested in forecasting. Basically, the fact that everyone, got big things wrong, and I wanted to know why, and some people got big things right, and I wanted to know why, and whether I could do as well as they could. So ever since then, I started, on my own, forecasting, the outcomes of wars and elections, and with mixed results. But over 20 years. So so that's how I became interested.
I'm politically very interested in what's happening, and I used to read the 538 blog that was done by Nate Silver. He advertised for the Good Judgment Project.
I don't know where I saw the notice that you guys were putting together this program. It was on one of the standard outlets, maybe Wall Street Journal, maybe Bloomberg. But I read an article that you were putting together this forecasting tournament and that you were trying to find out what it is makes a good forecaster. And I feel like I owe the system. For so many years, I've been doing research, and I've relied on other people to contribute to that research, and they have selflessly. And so I'm a chronic volunteer as well. When somebody says, I need your help to do my research, I volunteer. For instance, the New York Blood Center contacted me and said, you're not allowed to give blood, but we've got this research program in blood donation. Will you come in and donate a pint of blood every month so we can see what happens? So I did that, just to pay back the system. So I'm paying back the system by being in the Good Judgment Project.
I think that bottom line, intellectual curiosity and just a willingness to put in the work and to think hard about specific problems and try to be as objective as possible is what allowed me to make more accurate forecasts than others within the pool. I wouldn't necessarily say that, what we did or what I did as an individual is the best possible at forecasting, because there, can be so many more improvements, I think, in terms of how much you know about a specific subject. You can always improve your level of knowledge, and I think you can always improve, how you're specifically viewing a situation, how that situation could potentially evolve. So having a greater understanding of how humans interact with each other, relate to each other, the political contours of specific situations and events, those are all things that you can gain greater knowledge on and get better at forecasting in. So being open-minded and being open-minded enough to realize that you need to remain open-minded, I think are some of the keys to being, for my own forecasting performance.
Well, I think there were a couple of factors. One was that I am in the middle of my career now, and I've spent a lot of time studying exactly the kind of issues that the Good Judgment Project was focusing on. And so I was familiar with trade issues. I was familiar with national security issues, the rise and fall of governments, that kind of thing. So it really was right in my issue area. Also, I use a theory that can be well applied in this kind of situation. It's called structural realist theory, and it gives a sense of big recurring outcomes in international relations, the rise and fall of great powers, the tendency for military conflict to occur, competition in trade, and so forth. And so I had a kind of broad understanding of international affairs, that I could apply to particular situations. And the beauty of this theory was that it's really pretty open. States have a lot of choices about how they act. And so I wasn't falling into the trap of thinking that something was inevitable, but instead was investigating which things were more likely, which things were less likely. So this theory was really conducive to probabilistic forecasting, and my background knowledge was really helpful in having a big set of information to draw from, and also knowledge about where to find things, where to find information that would be helpful.
In what I do for my day job in maritime archaeology, it's a very similar thing. We take the outside view. We have very disparate information. We have maybe a few artifacts, maybe not even, maybe some historical sources, maybe someone stumbled upon something and just have rumors, historical studies, ethnographic studies, and we have to take all this information and try to piece it together to come up with a solution to, or an explanation of what we're finding. And it's very similar in forecasting. I kind of approach it the same way, where I'll take very disparate information. I won't take the big, huge pictures that are thrust in your face. I'll kind of take outside views and use some of the same tools that I use at work. I'm a huge proponent of using GIS mapping of different issues to try to get, like, say it's a question that has a geographical perspective. I'll make my own GIS program and basically, put the model together that has all the contributory information from different press sources, different mapping where different roads are, communication routes, transportation routes. And it's the same kind of thing I would do in archaeology. I just apply it to the future in forecasting as opposed to applying it to the past.
I don't trust my gut. So usually my first impression is right about half the time. So in order to do well in a forecasting tournament, you have to dig deeper into the sources. If you're predicting elections, for example, find out, what happened in the past, which parties were likely to win and under what circumstances. Do your research about the electoral system. Sometimes the electoral system could lead to a counterintuitive result. A party could do very well in the polls and still lose the election. So it's just really a matter of doing your homework, trying to understand the situation, the history behind the event, and really working hard at it. And I would say a second reason would be my sense of history. So I think that comes in very handy because most people, when they would forecast whatever event it is, would really look to the recent past, draw on their own memories as well as maybe a Google search of the recent news events. But I think having a sense of history that stretches back far can give one a sense of possibilities which the recent past might not indicate.
I think that I make connections. For instance, I couldn't figure out why Putin was in Syria. None of the explanations that people gave, the talking heads, made any sense to me. Syria does not adjoin Russia. The Ukraine does. Syria is of no strategic importance to Putin. Why is he in Syria? There was just no reason. All of this business about how he couldn't let one of his henchmen down or else all the other henchmen would feel insecure, I just didn't buy that. I wanted to make sense of that, and all of a sudden, I remembered something, and that is that Putin is building up the Russian fleet in the Mediterranean, but they don't have a home port in the Mediterranean, so they have to go all the way back to Russia and the Black Sea to get a home port. Well, where is Putin landing his troops? Next to the port of Latakia, which is a major port on the Mediterranean. So perhaps what Putin wants is a deal with Assad for a 50-year lease on the port of Latakia. Now that, to me, makes sense. That would explain why Putin is in Syria. It accomplishes a strategic thing for him. It gives him a port for his Mediterranean fleet. So I think that's probably part of the reason why I was successful. I I feel uncomfortable saying successful because I don't feel successful. You tell me I was successful, but I don't feel successful. That's part of the modus operandi that I go through is I see disparate things and I try to make sense of them. For instance, another thing, when the third Kim took over North Korea, all of a sudden there was a huge round of executions, including his own uncle. He blew his uncle up with an anti-aircraft gun. Things were then fairly quiet, and then another big round of executions. I couldn't figure out why he was executing all these people. I contacted somebody who was an expert in North Korean relations, and I said, why all the executions? He said, well, there have been more than you know. They're just not publicized. There have been two big rounds. I thought, what's going on here? And then I saw something that said, Kim has not yet traveled outside of North Korea, not even to Beijing, to visit his sponsors. We don't know when Kim is going to travel outside of North Korea. All of a sudden, you put the two together. Perhaps the guy's afraid that if he leaves the country, he won't be able to come back, that there'll be a coup in his absence, and he's taking care of everybody who might be involved in such a coup. And in fact, he's now due to go to Moscow, I think, in December. So again, trying to make sense out of something, just looking around at how things might fit together to make things make more sense than they would otherwise.
The tournament taught me that, and in a very humbling way, that I knew a lot less about the world than I thought I knew. And so that, to begin with, spurred my thirst for knowledge and information. It also gave me a perspective about risk-taking, because in my first year I was not a superforecaster. I had to earn that status, and I was involved in a marketplace which involved essentially trading. And I learned a lot about risk-taking and how much I was either risk-averse or overly risky. Learning about things from a perspective of other information has been very important. But once I became a superforecaster, in particular, what was helpful to me was a perspective of others. The sharing of information and the ability to test your own beliefs and hypotheses for bias by taking into account what others have said or analyzed, as well as information that contradicts your own, has been very valuable to me.
I was very steady. I answered as many questions as I could. I was consistent. I updated. I didn't let anything get forgotten. And I approached it like I was taking a test at school. Come in and maybe I didn't even study. So, but hey, it's not an essay test. So the choices are very clear. It's numbers, and I would read the question carefully and analyze whether this would hinge on a single factor or many factors. If it was something that I had a clear gut feeling right off the bat, then I would decide how much to back off from that extreme. And if it was something where I was really undecided at the 50-50 mark, I would force myself to a choice, because 50-50 is never quite the right answer. One of my hobbies is oil painting. So, and also when I've been taking the test, they tell me I'm visual spatial. So I think that may have made a difference. Getting the big picture and knowing when to zoom in to the details. Backing off and then zooming in. And not getting distracted by the wrong details. So I've learned in painting that you have a big canvas, you make broad strokes, but sometimes just the tiny nuance here or there changes the way the whole painting looks. And I think that's true in world events too, and why you need a lot of different perspectives. So that I love my news sources. I have my favorite ones, but when you get a variety and when you hear feedback from other forecasters, it really helps.
It's painfully clear that the more the wiser and more thoughtful and rational you are, the better you're going to do. And so I'm afraid, that it's kind of the same people who would do better a lot of different things that require mental effort are the ones that rise to the top in forecasting. I think what's special about forecasting is that if you're a really natural researcher, that can get you quite far. And I just completely admire and am grateful to those of us who are so good at it and who have, far-flung connections to decision centers in the world. I'm sort of a free rider in that way. So there are two things that are really important, and so I come from one side of that. I'm a person who was a natural for computer programming, for example, but not a natural for writing or researching.
Okay, well, along with not trusting my own gut feelings, my first impressions, I don't trust the gut feelings of experts and pundits. I try to, whenever possible, to understand what assumptions underlie their forecasts. Sometimes they're explicit about this, and other times they aren't. They don't really, they'll say, this event is likely, but not really explain. And if I keep doing my research and find other pundits who say a certain event is likely without, much explanation at all, then that's a signal for me to really do some deep research and try to, even if I agree with that assumption, sometimes I'll just try to play the devil's advocate and say, well, let's pretend that this silly outcome that's unlikely to happen, actually could happen, and kind of play that out. And sometimes, I'll go back to my original estimate. Yeah, that's silly. It's not going to happen. But, often is the case that the silly outcome becomes the more likely one. So that's one thing I do. Another is I try to discover or to find out, who has the power in a certain situation, who is the decider, in the words of George W. Bush, and that's one that keeps coming back all the time. And also, in every forecast, you want to, write down a list or in your head, of all the constraints that would prevent a certain event from occurring, or slow it down, make an event, a likely event take longer to occur than, what was expected before. So those are just a few things.
The first one was there's almost no, but I'd say there's nothing is certain. That's not entirely true. I'm sure there's certain things that are certain, but for the most part, nothing is certain. The other thing was don't trust one source of information, but then don't discard all sources just because you think it's not valid. Whenever you're reading a source of information, if you have just one single source and he's the only one saying it, sometimes I wouldn't dismiss it, but I would not trust it. I'd look for something that would, contribute to it or just help verify it. And that can even be one of these sources where, you see it on the internet and you think, wow, that's really dubious. These guys are, pretty crazy. But somewhere in there, if you read through the whole thing, there might be one sentence which corroborates what's going on in that other source. That was a single source. And I was like, okay, now I've got two independent sources. And you can start to build on that. So one of the things I would always say is don't rely on the one, but don't discard sources just because you may think they're a bit out there. And there are quite a few sources that are out there.
I think maybe the big thing is just to be aware of what you know, what you can be certain of, and what you're not sure of. To know the difference between subjective and objective knowledge, what things can be measured, and what things are a matter of opinion. Look at history, look at patterns, look at base rates. and then figure out whether your circumstance is similar or different. I mean, what was interesting for me is that most of the things I was forecasting on, I knew nothing about going in. Finance questions, for instance, I never pay attention to finance. But when you're forecasting on world currencies, you can always find graphs, historical charts, and I look at them and I see the patterns, and I say, why is it different now? Are we operating between the same extremes, or will it be new? And usually I've gone with stay with the trends. So I didn't let myself get intimidated by any questions, and I tried everything. And as Bill mentioned, some of the things where I actually was most hesitant on topics that I might have knowledge on, say on Ebola, because suddenly I do know, I'm actually more self-conscious about things where I might miss something that I should know.
One easy to follow tip is do it every day, and every question that you're forecasting, have a look every day to see if anything has changed. When things do change, significantly, it tends to come as a surprise, and if you missed that day, well, you blew that forecast for that day. My approach is to try to think through causal mechanisms and try to think of all the influential factors that I can think of, and try to visualize scenarios and balance probabilities among scenarios, things like that. This is a little different than what I think most of us are led to do by the training we've had, which is, it's not that the training doesn't cover probability, and that's critical, but it's to look at the categories of the questions we're forecasting and try to find parallels in the past and look for rates of occurrence and try to use those rates. I think that's helpful as a starting place, but it's not going to get you a very good score if that's all you do. And I think the difference between sort of phoning it in and getting a good score is understanding the situation as well as you possibly can. And that's what Phil Tetlock has called the inside view as opposed to the outside view. He emphasizes that people neglect the outside view, but I think it's the inside view that really matters to get you exceptional forecasts that actually could give real value. Anyway, that's the inside view.
Well, the first thing was to really explore my biases, to realize that I often would have a first impulse about a question, and I didn't want to just go with that. Sometimes it was right, but I didn't want to just go on impulse. And secondly, I really learned to think about what my strengths were, to focus on questions that I thought were in my area of strength, and in particular to focus on questions that I thought were being answered wrong, or where the general consensus was different from what I thought it was. So, because there I could make the most difference in shifting opinion or contributing knowledge that might sway the crowd and make the group as a whole more accurate. So I think those things were really important.
A good friend of mine, also named Barbara McClintock, advised me over and over in our conversations that I should always question my fundamental assumptions, my underlying assumptions. And I think that's something that's been very important to me, was Barbara's advice. For instance, a spacecraft just flew past Jupiter and took a whole bunch of high-resolution pictures of Pluto, and took a whole bunch of high-resolution pictures of Pluto. And son of a gun, this 4.5 billion-year-old planet is geologically active. And everybody is absolutely floored. The solar system is 4.5 billion years old. The planets are not supposed to be geologically active when they're the size of Pluto. Why is this so? Everybody's trying to figure out why 4.5 billion year old Pluto is geologically active. They're talking about more missions to Pluto, $500 million missions, $500 million missions. I'm certain that there are all sorts of young planetary scientists who are trying to figure out how they can start their careers by figuring out and making a name for themselves why Pluto is geologically active. Well, what's the underlying assumption here? The underlying assumption is that Pluto's 4.5 billion years old. What happens if Pluto isn't 4.5 billion years old? What happens if Pluto's a good deal younger? Then, in fact, you expect it to be geologically active, and there's no inconsistency here at all. The inconsistency is that your fundamental assumption that Pluto is 4.5 billion years old was incorrect. So I'd advise those young planetary scientists who are thinking about trying to explain how a 4.5 billion year old celestial body could be geologically active to question whether or not it's really 4.5 billion years old. There's another something else that gets a lot more attention, and that's Iran. For the last 4 to 5 years, the entire economy of the world has been in an uproar because all of the major nations have slapped an embargo on dealing with Iran because Iran is trying to build a nuclear weapon. And they had to negotiate long and hard with Iran to negotiate Iran away from a posture where they could be capable of building the nuclear weapon that they were trying to build. And this brought us a lot closer to allies like Saudi Arabia, to whom we perhaps should not be close. And it's caused no end of trouble throughout the entire world, particularly the Middle East, which is troubled enough. Well, what's the underlying assumption here? That Iran wants to build a nuclear weapon. They kept saying that they didn't want to build a nuclear weapon. Why didn't we believe them? Well, we have X, Y, and Z reasons why we didn't believe them. But again, it's a fundamental assumption. The entire foreign policy in the Middle East of nearly the entire world was dictated by the underlying assumption that Iran wanted to build a nuclear device. I personally wouldn't want to build a nuclear device. I can't see why Iran would want a nuclear device. Nuclear bombs are so 20th century. We've moved on. I happen to think Iran didn't particularly want to build a nuclear bomb, but everybody's fundamental assumption was that it did. And I would go out on a limb and I'd say that even in spite of all the acrimony that we've had over Iran, that it's quite possible that in 20 years, Iran will be our closest ally in the Middle East. And the reason for that is that Iran is the largest Persian nation on earth. The United States is the second largest Persian nation on earth, and Canada is the fourth largest Persian nation on earth. There's a natural affinity there. And as soon as that embargo is lifted, the Persians are not going to start doing deals with the British or the Chinese or the Russians. They're going to do business with their Persian-American friends. So I see business between Iran, Persia, and the United States, particularly the Persian community, building very quickly. And I think that could lead to good political relations as well. That would be a major casualty of misunderstanding Iran's intentions with nuclear weapons.
The process evolved over time for me. And one of the things that is important to me is to use historical information, but not to be over-reliant on it. If there is the ability to compare against similar situations in the past, I'm very cognizant of using that information, but only to the extent that it is truly relevant to the current circumstances. Beyond that, frequently adjusting my own forecast based upon new information and new perspectives of others is extremely valuable. It's very easy to take a position and sit back and say, that's it. However, the real world is a very active one, and often things change. And forecasts should change based upon the events and the happenings of the world. And I found it's extremely useful to pay a lot of attention to those events and frequently re-examine my own forecasts and see if they need to be updated.
So I really had 3 general rules when I made forecasts, especially when I made my first forecast on a new question or a situation I'd never seen before. So the first thing I would say is, to be a good forecaster, you have to hold strong opinions weekly. And what I mean by that is that you do all of your homework up front and you really present a good case for why you feel a certain way on a specific question and defending your probabilistic estimate at that point. But when you recognize that somebody else has more information or better information than you, having the ability to change your mind swiftly to that new forecast, I think that was one of the keys to why I was able to improve my performance over time. I think many people really get stuck on their initial forecast and they fall in love with it and wind up going into a defensive crouch when it comes to defending their opinion. Whereas I was on my team sort of notorious for being able to switch from one very hard position all the way to the opposite when I saw new information come up that led me to do that. The second thing is to be willing to put in the homework and to put in the effort to understand a situation, go beyond the Wikipedia page and to go beyond the initial couple of news articles and to really try to understand, what is it about Boko Haram and their composition that is allowing them to make the kinds of military gains that we're seeing, and how fragile or stable are those military gains compared to other like organizations, and to not just say, oh, Boko Haram looks like every other organization that I've encountered to this point, but to really try to understand what's going on there and to contextualize that appropriately. And I think the third thing is to have in your mind the kinds of psychological and cognitive biases that you could potentially fall prey to, and to be able to overcome those by listening to your teammates, by self-critique, and to recognize that whatever forecast and argument that you're putting forward now, you should be able to alter it or change it or improve it in light of new information. So, keeping in mind the cognitive biases that really impact and influence and reduce our accuracy, and to consciously try to de-bias them.
I think the tournament was great. You need to practice. So you need to have a lot of questions. You need to have feedback. You need to know where you're good and where you're messing up. If you have a team, if you have other people that you're in tournament, either in competition or in collaboration, either way, you listen to them, you get feedback, and you will improve.
I think that one of the things that would be extremely useful would be to participate in Good Judgment's open forecasting competition, because you can test your own abilities and learn about the things that both limit your ability to forecast and make you a better forecaster, and through that process become somebody who is more adept at forecasting. The Good Judgment Incorporated itself has put together various training methods which have been very useful to me as a superforecaster, and I'm sure to others. But as an individual, just forecasting and using that forecasting experience can be a very valuable thing to learn about yourself and the process of forecasting, and what you do well and what you do less well, and then to seek ways of improving upon those weaknesses.
I think you could really do 2 things to become a good forecaster, and one is to read, and not just read, say, Phil's book, Superforecasting, or Dan Kahneman's book, Thinking Fast and Slow, which I think many of the forecasters who excelled in the tournament have read and done. I also think that, reading, say, histories like The Guns of August or books about bureaucracy by James Q. Wilson and others really improves your knowledge base and gives you a better context for looking at situations and being able to figure out whether there are any commonalities or patterns there that you can pick up on and that could potentially apply to future situations that look like that. So being well-read is, I think, a contributor to forecasting success. The second thing is to practice. Don't get hung up on wrong forecasts that you make initially. Don't get overly sensitive to those results. But to approach forecasting as something that you can improve on and have that growth mindset when it comes to making better forecasts. And so from there, you're able to say, okay, I start at some baseline level. I got some feedback, tells me I should improve in X, Y, and Z, and to really make a concerted effort to do that through practice.
Well, one of the things I would recommend would be to write down a list of all the things that would that you should be on the lookout for that might cause you to change your mind. So after you've done your homework, you've thought deeply about the event and the likelihood of it occurring. Write down a list of things that would happen leading up to the event, or signals, markers, whatever, that would cause you to change your mind. And the reason why I say write it down is because it's very hard to change your mind. And if you write it down, it might help you not to try to fudge things. Well, if it's just in the back of your head, it becomes a little bit more difficult to go against your original conclusion, because you've put a lot of work into this and you don't want to go back on it, and there's a natural tendency not to want to waffle or be too wishy-washy. But having it down on paper will just show you, well, I'm not being wishy-washy. Events have changed. Things have changed, and maybe my initial conclusion was wrong. I would say the third thing would be to play devil's advocate. Immediately after you've come to a conclusion and made a forecast, seek out information that would prove you wrong. If anything, just to cover all your bases. I'd say my fourth piece of advice would be to seek a wide variety of sources, even weak and biased sources, because sometimes you can find interesting information in very flawed sources. But that'll take some work on your part to determine, which part of these, particular reports are worth, holding on to, and which part should be discarded. It's not an easy task, but don't just casually disregard even bad sources, because you never know. From 4 years as a forecaster in the GJP tournament, I can say that another piece of advice I would give is to assume that things would take longer than your initial impression. That's a rule of thumb, because it happens consistently, time and time again, that whatever it is, a diplomatic initiative or what have you, events often will take a lot longer than what you think they will take, or what officials, the timetable of officials, and that's just been my experience from doing this for a long time. Final piece of advice would be embrace uncertainty. Don't get too hung up on getting things correct. You're never going to get everything correct. You're going to get a lot of things wrong. I would focus more on assigning viable or realistic probabilities to events. Just think of it in terms of, if I assign a 70% probability to a particular event, I'm going to be wrong 3 out of 10 times, So if you work on being well calibrated instead of trying to get everything right, I think that's probably a more fruitful endeavor.
Well, every year in the tournament, I kept a running list of what questions I'd answered, when I first answered them, how I first answered them, and it was really helpful to see how my opinion changed as new information came along. So I was, kind of keeping myself honest about what was my original opinion and what was making me change my mind. And I think that was really helpful because I learned a lot about what kind of pits I might fall into. If I get over-optimistic about suddenly there's a lot of news on a certain issue, I might have a tendency to think that something was more likely to happen, whereas maybe it wasn't really more likely to happen. So keeping track of my predictions was very helpful. I thought it was really important that I was forecasting anonymously at first. It made me more confident about making predictions without worrying about their effect on my reputation. And after all, I was in this to get better about forecasting. So I wanted to have the ability to make bets or answer questions in a way that I thought was correct without worrying about how that might be seen somewhere else. And that really built up my confidence, and actually through being right then, frequently, it built up my confidence to the point that I was willing to reveal who I was, and then got to experience the whole other dynamic of people knowing I was an expert, wondering what I thought about things, and then having to be cautious about not relying too much on my expert knowledge, but still thinking about the wisdom of the crowd. So I think the anonymity is really important, and also realizing that the magic of this whole study is in revealing that everybody has important information, and at different times, different people's information will be really valid and especially important, and finding that right balance between being confident in your own views and being open to the views of others.
Become comfortable with researching problems, have a great interest in what you're forecasting. Don't hesitate to dig right in to, study something new. Just get into it. Don't neglect, if you have any bent at all for statistics and probability, bring it into play. But that's kind of obvious to anyone who has that choice. Okay. I guess actually this might come up in your last question. I forget, but part of the muscle you want to strengthen intuitively is the muscle for balancing scenarios against each other and sort of averaging out probabilities intuitively, weighting them properly, things like that, balancing things against each other intuitively, things that are pointing in opposite directions. This is something you get better at and feel easier about by practicing.
I'd recommend that when you come to a new field about which you know nothing, that you browse the literature, talk to people if you can, attend lectures if you can, and listen for the totem words, the words which either consciously or unconsciously people in the field give special meaning. And I find that if you can figure out what those totem words are and then go away and figure out what they mean, you'll find out at least one of the things that's very important to people in the field that they don't say is important to them necessarily, but they give it importance by continually using these totem words or continually emphasizing them. For instance, last week I went to Grand Rounds at our regional hospital, and there was a cardiologist giving a talk. And he was giving a talk on the pharmaceutical management of cardiac patients who had circulatory problems with blockages, problems with leakages. He would go through a series of example patients. This patient comes in with these symptoms. What do? We immediately stent this patient. how do we drug this patient for the stent? We're going to use this compound and we're going to use this compound, but we're going to stay away from that compound because it can cause bleeding, and we don't want bleeding. Now, this patient has got a partially occluded artery and is in a lot of pain. We're going to give this patient warfarin because we need to dissolve that clot and prevent it from growing. However, we're not going to give this patient these other two drugs because they can lead to bleeding even worse than warfarin can lead to bleeding. We give combinations of these drugs because it reduces bleeding. Bleeding this, bleeding that. What I came away from, not knowing really that very much about how to treat cardiac patients, was that if we can generalize from just this one talk, what's most important is to keep the patient from bleeding no matter what you do. And so if I was given a new drug and asked to predict whether or not it was going to be a success, the first thing I'd look at is whether it causes uncontrolled bleeding or not, what the likelihood is, how it can be combined with other things, all from a standpoint of, does it cause bleeding? Now, that doesn't give you the answer to how that new drug is going to do, but it gives you a lead into it so that you can then begin to understand how things are going on. So I'd say look for the totem words. When you're reading an article, look for the words that the author of the article seems to come back to over and over, and then start by figuring out what those words mean.
Trust yourself, but doubt yourself as well, and always be prepared to be devil's advocate to yourself. If you're working within a team, that's even better, because most forecasters do not have a problem being devil's advocate, or what we call red teaming. And keep an open mind. Don't go into something thinking you know exactly what's going on. It never seems to work out that way. Just when you think you know exactly what's going on, it changes. And that would be the main thing, is just, be open to change. In Dr. Tetlock's book, he mentions that we're in perpetual beta. That is a great way of thinking of it, is always be willing to change and learn and just, go with it. A lot of people get really kind of stuck in the mud on certain ideas, and that's the quickest way to get it wrong.
I've been very insecure all my life for a variety of reasons. And I never really thought very much of my own opinions. I always figured, well, is the world crazy or is it me? And the answer was, well, I must be crazy. I think the Good Judgment Project has shown me that occasionally I'm right and other people are wrong, which is not something that I expected going in. I expected to be wrong all the time. And curiously, and I've seen this in Phil's book and I've heard it from other people, the things about which I was most wrong were the things I was supposed to know something about, namely the medical questions. So I think the Good Judgment Project has given me a little bit of confidence in myself that I didn't have before I went into it.
It's been huge. And first off, you get exposed to a lot of wonderful people whom you tend to maintain some degree of contact with. I've had a couple of my teammates visit me at my house, one who's from South Africa, the other one's from Spain. It's true they were in Washington for other reasons, but that's an example, and I'm glad to stay in touch with a lot of in fact, there have been others as well from the D.C. area. Anyways, I'm glad to stay in touch with these new friends. That's a big thing. And just as big is there's nothing like reality, focusing on reality and how it works out, and you tried to see the future, and maybe it worked and maybe it didn't, and you sort of mentally record. There's feedback going on it's extremely good feedback for turning you into a more rational person. It makes you a more balanced person, a more rational person, easier to live with, perhaps. I don't know, but it's all good. It's been very rewarding, and this doesn't mean that the forecasters shouldn't also be rewarded in other ways, but this by itself is rewarding, and I'm sure that the others feel much the same.
I think being a forecaster and being a researcher are similar and different. I think that one of the great things about being a forecaster is that we really weren't constrained by any of the kind of customs or sociology around forecasting because we were the ones coming up with that. And so we were able to explore and be very free in how we approached forecasting. Whereas I think research, while you have some freedom in the hypotheses that you are tackling, a lot of the methodology and the structure around writing papers and peer review and submissions is very much rigid, and you must follow the specific process. So I think that highlights a major difference in forecasting versus doing the research, in that the research seemed to be much more process-oriented, although obviously there is an outcome component to it, whereas when we were doing strictly forecasting, really people only cared that we were able to come up with the right answers rather than how exactly we got there. So yeah, they're different. They're different animals.
I use different words when I talk to myself now. I've always been very analytic, but now I start talking those percentages to myself, and that's different.
My wife and I have two different philosophies of investment. She has been involved over the years as a partner in an investment firm that does alternative investments, which are allegedly less risky, but by my lights carry a risk that is sometimes more than what I'd like. I, on the other hand, am much more risk averse, and although less risk averse than I was when I first started participating in Good Judgment Project. My professional career has been oriented towards reducing the risk that decision makers have, and perhaps I've taken that point of view in my own approach to investing, which my wife feels is overly conservative. I think that the forecasting as part of the Good Judgment Project has given me a window into my own risk-taking perspective and moved me at least somewhat closer to my wife's point of view. And I think that that's a very useful thing in real life as well as, from a standpoint of participating as a superforecaster.
So in my work, this experience has been extremely important. I am now working on an article about the rise of China that I would not have written if it had not been for my experience in the Good Judgment Project. By having to constantly update my knowledge about China's economic capabilities and its military capabilities in order to do well in this game, I kept up at a much finer grain level with things that were happening in China and that have changed my forecast about how international relations will work over the next couple of decades. So I'm an international relations scholar. One of the most important things in the international relations field right now is this question of does the United States have peer competitors? Is China one yet? And this experience helped me see that it is. So it's really dramatically changed my career. And the process of going through the confidence building process of learning how to articulate forecasts, learning how to how to express them in probabilistic terms, how to be confident even if I'm not completely sure, has made me willing to take the risk of going out on this really controversial subject.
I'm not sure that they have, although they probably should. Having practice at forecasting geopolitical events, maybe I should start practicing forecasting events related to my own personal life. Maybe that would help me avoid being unpleasantly surprised by by things. But so I'm not really sure how it's affected my personal life, other than having nice dinner time conversations with families and friends.
Like I said, I go back and forth between the different venues of inquiry in archaeology and in forecasting. So there has been times where one of the things that forecasting told me is it's great if you have a model, but there can always be a better model. Always be a better model. You might have one that's showing you exactly what you want, but if you tweak it a little bit, or you say you find a new data set, it can always be that little bit better. And I've started to apply that to some shipwreck hunts that I've been doing, where we have a model on how to locate shipwrecks in areas of high probability, but it can always be better. So I've actually started tweaking some of the models that I use at work to add additional data sets, maybe pulling things from multidisciplinary studies from geomorphology, marine geomorphology, riverbed hydrological processes, going into shipwreck site formation, and just basically constantly tweaking the models. There's something. The other thing that I've tried to do as much as I can is I have 2 young sons who I'm trying to teach them how to approach different issues. Not so much to get them in trouble at school for questioning the teacher all the time, which is very possible, but when they answer a question, say, well, is that it? I spoke to my son about a tree growing in a field, and I said, well, how much do you think that tree is going to grow next year? And he just said, oh, well, this. I said, why'd you say that? He's like, well, because it just looks like, well, did you think about how much is it going to rain next year? How much fertilizer is the farmer going to put in that field where that tree's in the middle? How often is he going to plow it? There's so many issues that surround one issue that when you hear one question, there's usually 20, 30, however many more questions that can help you answer that question. So I've been trying to push it on them to kind of think that way.